We are continuing on with our months-long discussion of the Eucharist during this year of Eucharistic revival here in the United States. So first we talked about the sacrament of the Eucharist itself. We looked at several Eucharistic miracles, and then we talked about the liturgy. And the final thing we'll be doing is talking about the Mass in a line-by-line detail. But before that, we started to take a look around the church and explain why things look the way they look in a Catholic church, what certain things mean and what they symbolize and why they're there. So last time we talked about the Old Testament origins of church architecture. We talked about the different names we give to different types of church buildings, basilicas and cathedrals and shrines and chapels. And today we're going to move into the actual building of the church and describe some of the things that you'll see in a Catholic church. This is going to be sort of an overview of major features without going into a great amount of detail. Some of these are pretty obvious and straightforward. You no doubt already know what they are, but hopefully you will learn some of the history behind it. So let's begin by talking about the different parts of the building itself, the church building. And to describe the major features of a church building, we're going to have to know a little bit more about church architecture. So many of the great medieval churches and cathedrals of Europe and the churches that sort of imitate that style, they're built in what is called a cruciform shape. And it means it's cross-shaped. It's exactly how it sounds. Now imagine this type of church, you're in a helicopter looking down at it from above, and these classic churches will literally be in the shape of a cross if you're looking at it from above. And each arm of the cross is a different part of the church. And they're sort of incorporated into most churches today, even though our churches don't always look like crosses. So first, let's talk about the long bottom portion of the cross. You enter into the church from the bottom, and you move toward the top to get to the front. This long bottom portion is called the nave, and it's usually the largest part of the church. The nave is where the congregation gathers for the liturgy. So the nave is all of the area basically from here to the back of the church. And in most churches, this is where all of the pews are located. If you recall, last time when I was talking about the history of church design, I talked about the tabernacle in the desert and the temple in Jerusalem. And both the tabernacle in the desert and the temple in Jerusalem had a place where the people would gather as the sacrifices were being offered by the priests. And this was a place that was separated from the priests and was often referred to as the courtyard of the peoples, or the courtyard of the people. And the nave is essentially that. It is the courtyard of the people. Now the word nave comes from the Latin word navis, which means ship, as in like a big boat. The ship was an early Christian symbol of the church on earth. Sometimes the church is referred to as the ship of St. Peter. Maybe you've heard that before. Or even the Ark of Noah. Noah's Ark sort of calls to mind that we are God's people on a journey to heaven through this world, and the waters of the flood sort of represent the passing temptations and distractions of this world, and the Ark of the church is what leads us to the safety of dry land, in this case, heaven. Another reason that the main body of the church is called the nave is that is called the nave or a ship, is because if you look at many churches, the vaulted ceilings sort of represent an upside-down hull of a ship. Anyways, going back to our bird's eye view of a classic cruciform church, we can give a name to the two short arms of the cross. So what are those? The short arms are called the transepts of the church. The word transept simply means perpendicular, which makes sense. The two arms of the cross are perpendicular to each other. The transepts, they may contain more pews as sort of overflow seating for the nave, or they could contain even entirely separate chapels on either side of the church. Most smaller churches like this one don't have transepts. They don't have a need for the extra space. Our cathedral in Lincoln does, for example. It's a big church. One of the best examples of church transepts are in the Immaculate Conception Chapel at St. Gregory the Great Seminary in Seward. It's in a cruciform shape, and on either side of the main body of the church, you have two transepts, and these are two chapels. On one side, there's a chapel dedicated to St. Joseph, and on the other side, there's a chapel dedicated to Mary. And each of these two chapels has their own altars, their own pews facing those altars, and Mass can be offered there to smaller groups that don't really take up that much space in a larger chapel. So going back to our cruciform shape, the area where the nave and the transepts meet is the sanctuary. The sanctuary is the part at the front of the church where the sacrifice of the Mass is offered. It's where the priests and the other ministers carry out the liturgy. And this is the sanctuary is sort of a visual representation of a spiritual reality where the sacrifice of the Mass is sort of the center of the church on earth. And so it's sort of at the center of this cruciform church design. The sanctuary is almost always at a higher elevation than the nave. You may have to go up a few steps. In the cathedral, I believe there are 12 steps leading up to the bishop's chair representing the 12 apostles. Some churches have more than others. In some churches, the sanctuary is tiled or carpeted with a different material that sets it apart from the rest of the church, from the nave, to sort of emphasize the importance of what takes place in the sanctuary. The word sanctuary means, it comes from the Latin word sanctus, which means holy, and that's a reference to the Old Testament. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The tabernacle in the desert and the temple in Jerusalem, they both had a section of the complex called the sanctuary. Within the sanctuary was the Holy of Holies, and so we use that word, sanctus, or holy, for sanctuary. In a Catholic church, the sanctuary refers to the space where the priests sort of do their thing. It includes all of the furnishings that you see here up front. We'll talk about those in a bit. You may, from time to time, hear non-Catholics refer to the entire interior of their church as the sanctuary, including both, the front up here and the nave. And it's all a sanctuary to them. While there might be a place up front, for preaching, the focus in a non-Catholic church is different. There is nothing about a non-Catholic church that says, well, this is where the priests do their work. And that's because they don't have a priesthood. And nor do they offer the sacrifice of the Mass. So their idea of a sanctuary is different. It's not a place for offering sacrifice. It's a place for joining in fellowship. But in a Catholic church, the sanctuary it's only the front part of the church where the Mass is offered. So if you have the nave and the transepts and the sanctuary where they meet, what's the little piece on the top of the cross? Well, we probably think, we don't have that part in a church because the sanctuary ends with a crucifix and a tabernacle, and there's a wall, and then it's the outdoors, really. So we don't call it anything. But that's because most churches, at least in this part of the world, are not cruciform churches. But it is relevant to our church, and I'll sort of explain it in a roundabout way. So in a truly cruciform church, it actually does keep going past the sanctuary. There is a shorter aisle with pews that is behind the altar. And if you just Google the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, for example, and you'll see what I mean. Like the altar is in sort of the middle of the church where the two arms of the cross meet. And in these medieval style cruciform churches, the part that goes past the sanctuary is called the choir. In this case, the choir is not referring to a group of singers, but it's referring to this place within a church where the singing is led. So if you're in a cruciform church, you walk into the choir, you will often come across something strange. Instead of the pews being lined up like we're used to having them facing the altar, the pews are actually lined up along the same direction as the aisle. So they're lined up out this way instead of back to front. They're lined up from side to side facing the center aisle. And the reason for this has to do with the liturgy of the church. As we talked several weeks ago, the liturgy is not only the Mass, it's not only the sacraments, but it's also what is called the liturgy of the hours. So the liturgy of the hours are prayers that are designed to be said throughout the day in order to dedicate that entire day to God. and to extend the celebration of the Mass throughout the day. There are 7 times a day that these prayers can be prayed. There's early morning, mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, evening, and nighttime. And that's why they're called the Liturgy of the Hours, not because they take hours to pray, but really, if you add it up, it takes maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, if you total it all up. But it's called the Liturgy of the Hours because these prayers mark the hours of the day. And anyone can recite these prayers. They're publicly available. Sometimes on Tuesday nights when we have Eucharistic adoration, we pray the Liturgy of the Hours as part of our hour. But priests and religious sisters and brothers and monks and nuns, they make a promise to pray these prayers every day. And so we do. In the past, I even forgot to bring it, but in the past you may have seen priests carrying around sort of a black leather-bound book, maybe about that thick, about that big. But anyways, people probably assume that those are Bibles that priests are carrying around, but actually they're more likely a prayer book called a breviary that contains the Liturgy of the Hours within it. When we entered the seminary, we were given the instruction, consider your breviary your new girlfriend. Never leave her behind. Of course, now there is an app for that, just like there is anything else. We don't have to lug around a 4-volume set of prayer books wherever we go. But anyways, there's an actual point to me telling this. So it does have an impact on the design of our churches. The Liturgy of the Hours is to be prayed, but it was also designed to be sung. And at the heart of each of the 7 hours of the Liturgy of the Hours are the Psalms. Usually there's 3 Psalms for each of the 7 hours. And each Psalm is divided up into verses that are 3 or 4 lines long. And when the Liturgy of the Hours is prayed in public, the 2 sides of the church recite the verses back and forth to each other. And the one side of the church will say the first verse, and the other side of the church will say the second, so on and so forth. And that's why the pews in a choir face each other, to facilitate this back and forth recitation of the singing or the praying of the Psalms. And we call this arrangement of the pews choir seating. So if you ever hear me refer to choir seating, that's what it is. In fact, if you go to a seminary or a convent or a monastery, the entire church will sometimes be arranged that way with choir seating that is perpendicular to the sanctuary rather than facing the sanctuary. It does make the Mass a bit awkward. If you want to face the front of the church, you basically have to sit sideways in your pew, but that's the way it is. So how does all this have an impact on our church? Why do I bring it up? Well, this whole choir seating behind the altar sounds a little bit strange to us, but we do have a remnant of that right here in this church. It's right where Cheryl's sitting. That is choir seating, and it's for the church choir. It's sort of a remnant of that medieval design. It's just off to the side instead of behind the sanctuary. Also, what we're more familiar with in America is choir lofts. And the reason for choir lofts in the back of the church is that back in the day, only the priests and the servers of the Mass were allowed into the sanctuary during the celebration of the Mass. So in a classically cruciform church, you would have to pass through the sanctuary to get to the choir, and if you weren't a priest or a server, you couldn't be there. And so you wouldn't be able to sing in the choir. So choir lofts come into practice so that non-clergy were able to sing in the choir. So that covers the main parts of the church space itself. There's other parts as well. The confessional and the cry room, they're pretty self-explanatory, except here in Cambridge, for whatever reason, the cry room is labeled the quieting room, and I think it's a little optimistic. And in Arapaho, the cry room and the confessional are the same thing. I promise it's due to a lack of space, not because I make people cry during confession. But you often have in churches what is called a narthex. And a narthex is sort of an entryway or a foyer that leads into the church. Sometimes it's called a vestibule. Sometimes it's called a gathering space, I've heard it called. But traditionally it's called a narthex. And I had no idea what the word narthex, like where its origins are, before doing the research for this homily. But I'm really glad that I did, because it's absolutely ridiculous. So, believe it or not, the word narthex is a Greek word meaning giant fennel. Fennel as in the plant. All right, so the ingredient that you use to make spaghetti sauce or Italian sausage. Only in the Catholic Church. It's that Roman, right? So apparently the giant fennel plant had a hollow stem. And this was the reason that it was used to describe the smaller entryway, like a tube opening up into the much larger volume of the church. So the narthex serves a functional purpose. It keeps warm or cold air from outside getting into the church. But originally, the narthex was designed to separate those who had yet to be baptized from those who already had. Originally, you had to be a baptized Christian to enter into the nave in order to attend Mass. But those who are awaiting baptism, they attended Mass from the narthex. And for that reason, some churches, they have a separate place where baptisms take place called a baptistry, and that's often located near the entrance of the church. And that sort of symbolizes that baptism is the sacrament by which we enter the church and we become a member of the church. Baptism opens the door to all the other sacraments. You also find a room in a church called the sacristy. Ours is right there. This is a room where vessels and vestments are stored, and it's also where the priest and the servers prepare for Mass. The sacristy is usually somewhere near the sanctuary of the church for obvious reasons. It's not always, but some churches may have more than one sacristy. For example, in Arapahoe, there were originally two sacristies, one for the servers and one for the priests. But now there's just one large sacristy, and the other one is a storage closet. But anyways, some churches have more than one. So those are the most important areas or features of a typical Catholic church. Now we're going to talk about some of the furnishings in a Catholic church, in the sanctuary specifically. So the center of focus in any Catholic church is the altar. That is where the holy sacrifice of the Mass is offered. Unlike other Christian churches, the altar is not simply a table that we gather around to sort of reenact the Last Supper. It's an altar in the ancient meaning of the word, an instrument used to offer sacrifice. And in our case, it is the place where the perfect sacrifice that Jesus made once and for all on Calvary is made present to us and offered to God. It is the fulfillment of all the altars in the tabernacle and the temple that we hear about in the Old Testament. Usually altars contain a relic of a saint. A relic is a part of a saint's actual body or a piece of something that belonged to a saint. They're usually very tiny, like half a grain of rice big. The reason we find relics in our altars goes back to the earliest days of the church, during the Roman persecutions in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and early 4th centuries, where Christians didn't have churches. That would be an outright advertisement to the persecutors. And so oftentimes Mass was celebrated secretly in the catacombs of Rome, underground cemeteries where the martyrs of the church were entombed. And so having relics in our altars sort of represents that ancient reality, that ancient tradition. Unfortunately, I don't know if our altar contains a relic or not, or if it does, which saint it is. I haven't found that documented anywhere. There may be several altars within a church, the altar of sacrifice being the main altar, but you can also have side altars in some churches that you visit, that they might be dedicated to different saints. Think of St. Catherine's in Indianola has a couple of side altars, and Mass can be offered on those side altars for certain occasions. There's also what is called the altar of repose. We have one, it's right over there underneath the tabernacle. The word repose is the word that we use when we store the Eucharist in the tabernacle. We repose the Eucharist. And that's why the altar on which the tabernacle is located is called an altar of repose. Which brings us to the tabernacle itself. This is the fulfillment of the tabernacle in the Old Testament. Much like the Ark of the Covenant, it is a sacred vessel that contains God himself in the Blessed Sacrament. Tabernacles are to be made with precious metals. They must be lockable. They must be permanently fixed in place to ensure that they don't get tampered with. And so while the altar is the focal point of the Mass, the tabernacle is the most sacred place in a Catholic church. And that's why we bow when we pass in front of the altar, but we genuflect when we pass in front of the tabernacle. When you genuflect before going into your pew, for example, you do it because you aren't genuflecting in some general direction at the front of the church. You're directing that genuflection to the living God, your creator, who is contained within the tabernacle. Also near the tabernacle is the sanctuary lamp, that is the candle that's kept burning to indicate the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. It's usually kept in a red glass shade. So that's sort of the rule of the thumb whenever you're visiting a new Catholic church is you look for the red candle to find where the tabernacle is. Another focal point in the sanctuary is the ambo. Many of you have probably never heard of an ambo before, but you already know what it is, I guarantee you. The ambo is where the scriptures are read and where the homily is preached. It's called ambo because the word ambo is another Greek word for step, like a step up or to elevate, and it's a reference to a feature in some ambos where you actually have to go up a step or even a set of stairs in some cases to reach the pulpit. You may hear the word pulpit or lectern used in other Christian churches, but the official term for Catholics is the ambo. And some of these ambos are really fancy. The most impressive one that I've seen in our diocese anyway is probably the Newman Center in Lincoln. It's this giant wooden thing that you have to climb up into, and they only use it for the preaching of the gospel and the reading of the gospel, and so all the other readings are done from a smaller lectern. So that about does it for the major features of a Catholic church. And next we'll go into the smaller details, the other things you see around the church, the vessels and the vestments that are used in the liturgy.